Well, hello and welcome to episode 21 of the Ascension Speed Show. My name is Lyft, and I'm also joined by Captain Scotch. Hello, Scotch. How are you?
I'm doing well today. It's a giant thunderstorm outside, so if you hear lightning in the background, it's not my fury about Robot Path. It's just the outdoor conditions.
We're here to talk about You Robot, which was the spring challenge path in Kingdom of Loathing. The core gameplay of this challenge path was that your adventure was being brought back to life as this incredibly janky robot and made of random junk and garbage that the council threw together. So think Cogmind, but in KOL form. But there was, let's say, but three main implications that this had. And one of them was that you had zero organ space. So no food, no booze, and no spleen. So Scotch, how were turns generated in this path?
This path, they introduced a new mechanic called energy. So the vast majority of your turns ended up being generated through the use of energy. Essentially, it was a mechanic you gained either by gathering it at your campground through thunderbolts hitting a power line, or you could gain it through adventuring, through the use of CPU upgrades, as well as 1 point of energy that would naturally come with each combat that you spent in the path. You also could get it through the potted power plant, an item of the month that was introduced mid-path, that by the end of the path ended up being a pretty considerable chunk of your energy, especially in softcore. It's also worth noting, though, that magical sausages were edible, and rollover adventures operated as expected. So it wasn't your only way to get turns, but it was pretty close.
Was this one of the only paths where you didn't even get your starting 40 adventures?
I believe so. I'm not sure off the top of my head what are any other paths that did that, but you started this path with 50 energy. You did not actually start the path with any turns. What this meant in effect was that a lot of people, the second the path came out, were immediately soft locked because they spent their energy on a CPU upgrade, then realized they had no turns to do anything with. I believe in the chat, 3BH had this happen to him early in the path and had to drop to softcore, pull a hourglass, and get 5 turns from that.
Ouch. You also gained 0 stats from combats, from fights. And that didn't matter whether you ran a lot of monster level or if you ran plus stat gains. So how did you get your stats in Robot Path?
So in Robot Path, you generated all of your stats, well, not all of them, but the vast majority of them at your campsite. So similar to the getting turns through the chronolith at your campsite by spending energy, you were able to spend energy at the stat bot, which would raise you up 5 points in your stat. So you were at Moxie 10, you can immediately get to Moxie 15. The other thing that still worked and ended up being a very, very important piece of the path was the Commerce Ghost. So running about 100 to 200 turns of the stat bot, or the Commerce Ghost, was able to decrease the amount of energy that you had to spend on those stats, which was nice. The other thing that was very useful was that you still got stats from non-combats, most notably in the Haunted Bedroom, where you could essentially do a combat, get a non-combat, and then get a little bit of stats from that. That was actually very useful in Phil's very good stunt run that we will be talking about later this week.
Equally important is that you did not have access to all of your equipment slots. And so you had to exchange parts out, which required scrap. And so there was a lot of trade-offs that you'd have to do, and you didn't have a full loadout. What were some of the most painful ones?
The most painful of the equipment trade-offs had to be the fact that you couldn't run a familiar without giving up your hat slot. So essentially, the familiar was gated behind the ability to wear hats. What this meant was that for things like the war or fighting the Knob King, you were completely unable to bring a familiar. Similarly, there were a few path-specific buffs and a few path-specific attacks that you couldn't have unless you actually swapped out that slot. So, for example, for the Smut Orc logging camp, you want to do cold damage. You can't do that without giving up your hat/familiar slot for the cold attack that would let you actually overkill those monsters with cold damage. In order to trade out these slots, you had to spend scrap. So similar to energy, you could generate scrap at your campsite, or you could use some of these equipment slots to actually generate scrap passively, either the pants slot or the offhand slot. Most of the runners, at least in the logs that I was looking at, seemed to prefer the use of the offhand slot. There definitely were some strategic reasons to potentially use the pants slot for it instead, and we'll probably get into that a little bit later.
Thanks. So, in summary, robots, you collected energy, and you used this energy for both turns and stats. You collected scrap to swap out your equipment slots, and then you also had the usual avatar path limitations like no permed skills. We also have two other guests joining us. We have Ricardos, who managed a gold star for his softcore 2413 run. Ricardos, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Lyft, that's okay.
We ask all of our guests this when they join, but Ricardos, where does your name come from?
I don't have a great answer. This is a sort of, if I'd have known I'd have been here 16 years later explaining where my name come from, I would have thought of a better one. My actual name is Richard. Ricardo was my sort of very cunning sort of slight change to that, and that was already taken. So I sort of put letters on the end until it came out. So not the best story, but that's the truth of it.
How did you originally discover Kingdom of Loathing?
I can't remember. It was a long time ago. I certainly remember it was a sort of slightly bored afternoon, potentially at work, and I think I was probably just poking around for something to spend half an hour keeping me entertained. So maybe it was Reddit a thing then. It was probably something like that was recommending something to sort of take the time up.
When did you first start getting into the speed ascension side of KOL?
So I had a very brief. So I joined in 2005, and a couple of years later, they were just taking the sort of level 15 revamp was happening, and then just as that happened, I decided I'd like to go for a 1-day run. So that was a sort of one-off. I wonder if I can do that thing.
Mm-hmm.
Having done that, I sort of drifted away from the game a bit, like I think lots of other people have done, and then I came back maybe 3 years ago, found this Discord. Started to sort of read up and really just have since then been just doing what I can to, get a little bit faster each run.
Well, it definitely worked out. Congratulations once again. And we're also joined by the Erosion Seeker, who got a gold star in the hardcore path. Tess, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem.
All right, now we get to talk about some fun strategies that you guys were able to use in the robot path. Let's talk about the retro cape first.
The retro cape is one of the few items of the month that are better the fewer resources you have, whether that means skills or items of the month. So there is quite obviously the retro cape Yellow Ray, which is almost universally useful because your other standard Yellow Ray is the Pill Keeper. However, there are several other features on the retro cape that you wouldn't normally use otherwise. For example, the Heck General Stun is super useful when you're really bad at combat. +3 elemental resistance is much more useful when you don't have a passive 9 elemental resistance. Most interestingly, the Robot Police Cape, the Robot Kiss, is also an extremely useful combat skill that apparently nobody realized was extremely effective against monsters with a ton of HP when you have no other combat capabilities.
I think the most fun thing about the retro cape for me was just realizing it essentially is a combat suite in a bag. If you are in a robot class that doesn't have great combat or in an avatar path that doesn't have great combat skills, just equip the retro cape. There's probably something there you need. Whether that's going to be a big stun, whether that's going to be something that massively de-levels the monster. There's just a lot of different things that the cape can give you, which are just not really that useful in a place where you've got trivialized combat from Sauce Storm and Weak Sauce, but super useful when you don't have access to either of those skills.
The de-leveler was the one I used quite a lot because I found that at high monster level the stun was blocked, so that de-level from the cape, which also had the benefit of having a plus Moxie percentage. So obviously as Moxie classes, which I think pretty much every sort of high level run was, that's boosting your survivability and giving you that D level attack.
The other nice thing about the cape in this path, specifically was that your HP was very limited in Robot. It didn't scale off of your muscle the same way that it does for a normal class. So as a result, there was very little way to actually increase your HP other than flat HP modifiers. Now, if you have the Vampire Cloak, that is a lot better in terms of plus HP than the Retro Cape. But there were still some functions of the Retro Cape where you got a decent chunk of HP, and that, in some cases, was actually really helpful for survivability while using those skills.
You had a note here about the Tomb Rat King, and because item drop was so low.
I think this is less of a strategy for Robot specifically, although it's more useful in Robot than it is in other paths. But the Feel Envy skill from the Emotion chip, the February item of the month, actually does work on the Tomb Rat King for forcing their Tomb Ratchets. In this path, the item drop was so low that anything you could use to force a drop that's as high as 400% was extremely valuable. You could still kind of get there with Otoscope and a few other resources, but Envy had the advantage of only taking one round of combat, whereas using Otoscope plus also using the Vamp Cloak plus also using a few other things could potentially make your survivability in that fight more shaky, which you wanted to avoid, because dying in this path was, at least in your early runs, for me, something that happened pretty often.
And a death there could really set you back. Tangles were in very short supply.
They certainly were. What kind of monster level were you ending up at for the Tavern? I think I ended up at like 130 maybe on one of my runs, but I think that was the max that I ever saw in Robot.
For hardcore, 100 to 130 sounds about right.
And Ricardos, for you?
Yeah, same. Sorry, I was running mostly hardcore actually, and yeah, that sort of 100, around that 100 level was what I was shooting for. I think I took the owl from the campsite most times, so that was sort of helping me get up to the 120, 130 if you could do that.
Tess, I'd like to ask you about Susie in the arena. I heard you had some really fun tricks to do with familiar equipment.
Yes, so one of the things that you don't have in Robot is a bunch of free familiar weight from your perms. And so that means stuff like the Pocket Professor does not let you get nearly as many copies in Robot as you do in Standard. In addition, because you can't use the Diabolic Pizza on account of not being able to eat, you also can't force the Pocket Professor chip to get 2 extra copies. And so the solution that I came to was to get it the intended way, which was to use the arena to gain a bunch of experience in the familiar tests, get the pocket chip, and that would let me save additional turns.
I had totally spaced that you could get the familiar experience from doing those arena adventures. I remember talking about using the arena as a way to reset your orb, but the extra experiences just makes this an obviously really good move. Did it help you hit a certain breakpoint that wouldn't have been possible otherwise?
Very much so. So the trick was to get to a buff total of 37 total weight, which would mean you got a whole extra copy. So instead of getting just 2 extra copies per day with the chip, you would be getting 3. So if you spent 5 turns doing this, you would actually be saving you would be getting 1 extra turn to use. But then on top of that, you didn't just have to spend 5 turns in the arena. You could be spending 10, because what I actually did was use 9 combats worth on the Pocket Professor and 1 combat on the Camel. Because it doesn't care what you do for your first 4 wins every time, I was able to build 9 familiar tests worth of Pocket Professor weight, and then throw the last one to the Camel. So I could get 2 pieces of equipment while stacking an extra 36 experience to the Professor, which would easily let me hit the next weight threshold.
Oh, that's very cool. Scotch, I know we mentioned it, but could you tell us a little bit about the orb reset?
By the way, if anybody listening would like to help with orb spading, tag me on Discord and we'll talk about it, because I have a lot of thoughts on how we are currently spading it. One somewhat unexpected thing that I learned while spading it was that Susie's turns actually do reset the orb. It's not an adventure.php zone, but it does actually cause the orb to cycle through and generate a new prediction within the zone that you're in. So as a result, the Susie's turns aren't actually that bad. If you consider that they're actually getting you 4 extra copies just by getting that equipment, and potentially 6 extra copies with that extra threshold, it's not just turn positive, it's also letting you refresh those orbs, which is worth not an entire macro, but maybe like a half to a third of a macro. So it adds up. This is not a niche meme strat. This is just something that was definitely a good idea. One thing that I do want to note, though, is that you probably should at least practice doing combats in Susie's. This was basically the first time I had been in the arena and actually paying attention to how much experience I was getting from the fight since maybe 2006. So as a result, I just kept like looking at some wiki pages and being like, I'm not entirely sure what's going on here. And I actually missed a few points of experience on those first few professor fights, which ended up for me making me miss that threshold for 37 on day 1, but hit it on day 2. So for me, the strategy was kind of merely break even with the added benefit of the orb resets without necessarily being the kind of full-throated, fully built-out version of the strategy that Tess used to great acclaim.
Do you want to talk about the nuns or the war quest itself?
This was, I think, one of the few cool things that I did. Unfortunately, my softcore run was one of the first ones that I did, and I just did not have time to do a second one. But a lot of people skipped nuns in this path, which makes a lot of sense. If you think about it even kind of medium hard, you don't have a familiar for the war, so you can't actually bring a leprechaun with you. If you're not bringing a leprechaun, all you got are your base passive meat buffs and whatever meat buffs that you can get from the run itself, which is, as you may realize, not very much. However, in softcore, it was actually possible to do nuns and make it turn positive. It did require a few pulls, but it didn't require as many pulls as people thought kind of going into it. So what it ended up being was you had to pull a car battery, which kind of barely counts as a pull. You're already pulling many of them for energy. So the only real difference is that you aren't untinkering that into a lantern. You're just kind of spending 15 energy for an extra 100% meat buff. You pull an Icy Vapo Hotness Inhaler. You pull one of the plus 50% meat accessories, either the Wormwood Wedding Ring for spooky resistance and mysticality, or the Cursed Swashbuckle for meat drop plus item drop. And then you pull a Patent Avarice Tonic. This gets you to about 400% meat drop from pulls. You can add up to that 50% from the backup camera, 40% from the Frat Arena buff, 25% from a Whittled Flute, and 50% from the about anywhere from 10 to 11 combats you get of a wolf form. You then can add 20% from the Finance Neural Net if you have enough of an energy surplus that you can spend I believe it's 40 energy on getting that buff. Then, if you're, I would say, lucky enough or opportunistic enough to do this run on a day that overlaps the Pack Rat Smile Day, you can also get an additional 25% meat drop from the getaway campsite. This ends up getting you to a net of 585% and 610% on Pack Rat days. That gets you to an expected value right around 13 to 14 turns, which is just enough to actually hit it, assuming that you do a Stone Wool extension on that Icy Vapo Hotness Inhaler. Again, this is a high-risk, high-reward strategy. It ends up saving about 12 to 13 turns by doing it this way for the expense of about 3 pulls. That's a pretty good return on those 3 pulls. But in Robot, there are a lot of things that you're bad at, so depending on what your pull list actually looked like, it might have been a little bit hard to fit in. The other kind of downside risk, which I experienced in my run, was that if you do miss it, you have basically given yourself like a 5-turn disadvantage, because as soon as that Icy Vapo Hotness Inhaler wears off, your meat drop just completely plummets. It's essentially dropped in half, and what would have been 1 extra turn if you kept that same meat drop ends up being 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 extra turns. So again, not necessarily a strategy for all runs, but it was something that was an interesting strategy that I was pretty happy I at least got to try out.
Yeah, and I did not do that. on the nuns point, I think you might have put that into the chat sort of after it ended, Tez, and that was impressive to read after the event. I think it's probably fair to say I'm in the sort of my run was a kind of relatively solid application of fairly sort of well received wisdom. I don't think I had any secret source. Probably the strangest thing in my run was I used 11 clovers. Probably not normal.
That's quite a lot.
So I had two clover hermit days, which obviously was not something I could have guaranteed. I went marmot with the spoon changed. I started vol sign and then moved to marmot, but I pulled a green rocket, so I jumped into my run on Dependence Day. So I had a green rocket pull, which is one pull for 3 clovers. So with the starting clover, and I even managed a misclick. So I used a clover in Copperhead Club accidentally, and then pulled another one. So to your point, Tez, around pulls, I think I probably did have a reasonable number in the end of marginal pulls that probably, if I'd have known that nun strategy, I probably could have certainly made room for them on my pull list.
Is there a pull you're particularly proud of, or thought that it's fringe but it was a lot of fun?
I won't take credit, but the iFlail was something I think I saw on a Sawyer's list, which I found quite entertaining. So that was a good one. Yeah, the green rocket I've mentioned. Other than that, I don't think there was anything. The game grid token was good for pull skill on day one, and then really whatever you wanted on day two. There was obviously a load of flexibility given by that. Otherwise, fairly standard. I mean, only 7. I say only, but 7 car batteries, which I know there was some concern at one point that maybe the full pull list would be batteries. So I didn't go too crazy on that in the end.
Yeah, I think that 7 was almost exactly what I ended up pulling, maybe 8 because of the nun's trick. For me, the iFlail was definitely a surprising MVP of this path in terms of just being a really good pull. It was just generically extremely good. We kept joking in the chat that this was going to be the iFlail optimal path, and then it turned out to actually be the iFlail optimal path, which I very much appreciated. I would say that in this path, this is not exactly a game-breaking pull, but it is one that I do think is at least worth calling out. Keepsake boxes were so much better than they normally are, because that zone is garbage in Robot.
Yeah, and I pulled 6, so that was no-brainer. I think I agree.
For me, the thing with Smut Orcs is that it also got you back the energy that you would have been wasting. It wasn't terrible, but I do think those pulls had more value in this path than they normally do. What do you think, Tess?
So, because I did hardcore, I was not able to have the luxury of pulling keepsake boxes, and so that meant doing the Smut Orcs in the horrible intended way, which was to use the robot head upgrade for cold, which dealt cold damage based on your buffed muscle, and you wanted to deal 5 times the Smut Orc monster's HP, so that would be 346 or more damage, which would be really tough because you don't have a whole ton of buffs, you don't have a whole ton of resources, and even with stuff like triple size, you can't get 345 muscle easily. And it turns out that this was a path where a lot of really, really stupid tricks came to light, such as, the Ghost of Crimbo Cheer. It does this thing where it increases the amount of cold damage you do in a zone by 50%. So instead of needing 345 muscle, you could just have 231 muscle, which was significantly easier. So you would do this instead, blow snow with the robot skill, hit Black House every 3rd combat as you would in Standard, and then try to squeeze out as many parts from Black House as you could before doing it a couple more times to complete the bridge.
Actually, I think that's a good question to ask. What kind of parts were you guys getting from Black House? I think that I ended up getting around 11 to 12-ish, but I don't think that I quite maxed out what I could have done, because I don't think that I used my Ghost of Crimbo carols properly for it. I should have saved a carol for it, but I think I ended up using that on something else, and it just ended up not aligning very well for me.
I was 12 in my hardcore runs, I think.
I got all 14.
I'm so proud of you, and also very jealous. Yeah, so I'm assuming you used like the Carol Ghost to get Sleaze resistance.
Actually, yes. So this was one of the horrible strategies that I came up with for how to string together a bunch of very terrible quests together. So the thing that I did was prep to 100% spit with the camel at the end of day 1, kill a single pygmy bowler to prep the emotion chip Nostalgia, swap to the Carol Ghost, and roll over Runaway against, for example, a demon. So I could get +2 resistance. And then when rollover happens, you would get the Spoon Boon +2. You would get, next day, you would get stuff like the Can of Black Paint, the Retro Cape, and so on. Immediately, at the start of day 2, you try to encounter the Blue Oyster Cultist and force it. You spit, Nostalgia, Yellow Ray that, so you get your 4 bowling balls and your 4 cigarette lighters. Swap to the Crimbo Cheer Ghost to prep Smut. And then you could do that to pull off what I did for the Smut Orcs.
So I did part of that. I didn't execute it as well as you, which I think is a theme that has happened several times, especially in our dual Eldritch Tentacle runs last year. But I did use a rollover runaway to proc a Crimbo Cheer. Unfortunately, I did the wrong one. I didn't think to just use a demon. I ended up using it and getting, I think, the +50 muscle just in case I needed that. The one thing I will say that you mentioning this does make me remember, Spoon Boon was really nice in this path. Like, that was not a useless buff. The +5 prismatic damage made it really easy to hit the tavern thresholds you needed. The extra resistance was great for Smut Orcs. Like, there were actually a lot of things that you needed in that Spoon Boon buff that was just very, very pleasant and helpful once you kind of examined it and realized that it can route into several quests really nicely. So I guess if you don't have a Moonspoon, listeners, please contact 3BH. He has, I believe, 40 of them remaining.
But they go fast.
They go really fast. Gotta act now.
Participation in this path was lower than other seasons. Maybe a few reasons that it wasn't as active. I know for me, I didn't run a single one. Some of the reasons included, well, there was no skill buckets, and more importantly, there was no auto ascend support. So I would have to devote, time to 6 hardcore runs before even getting to try. More RNG because you had less ways to mitigate it. What do you think about the path in general? What were some of those reasons that the path wasn't as popular?
I think that mentioning the auto ascend support is a really good start. It's unfortunate because generally you don't want a path to be dependent on, kind of volunteer work that happens pretty often. But the fact that it just didn't get that coverage meant that I think several people who otherwise would have potentially jumped in on that last week and gone like, screw it, I'll try another run, just weren't able to do so. The progression mechanic in this path, while some people, and I will call myself out, it was me, some people thought it was initially somewhat weak. Actually, it was pretty strong.
Surprisingly, yeah.
Surprisingly strong. Like, when you did all of the math on the energy that you needed, the difference between a full progression account and a 1 to 2 Ascension account was pretty considerable in this path. It added up really quickly, and it led to a lot of trade-offs that made it harder to do certain things. So, for example, Ricardos, Tess, I'm pretty sure both of you in your kind of last hardcore run did get to use lantern batteries, right? Or at least one lantern battery.
Yes.
Yeah, that was one thing that as I tried to solve out how to use my energy, it just wasn't possible. The margin of error for finishing in 2 days and still trying to do a competitive run. It just didn't quite work out for me, which was unfortunate. This does just lead to kind of an unfortunate thing where people can't really play the path if they don't have that progression, and without buckets or auto ascend, there just wasn't really any way around run this path several times until you can do that one run that actually works.
What about combat, Ricardos? Was it trivial? Was it?
No, not at all. Actually, before we move off, so in terms of the path, I have a perspective on that. I think tension, as far as I can tell, of avatar paths is, to an extent at least, is to remove some of the sort of gap between, you know, high skilled accounts and, to an extent, you know, item of the month accounts. But you know, clearly removing, you know, the ability to use most skills is narrowing the gap. I think quite intentionally between, you know, sort of older accounts and newer accounts. I think the thing that Robot did, at least for me, was also narrowed the gap between, you know, the real sort of kind of elite people that know the all the mechanics of Cole sort of inside out. And I think we've already heard from, you know, Tez some really good examples of that I was never going to get anywhere near of those. But it allowed, you know, a person like me who sort of has maybe a solid knowledge of the mechanics, but I'm not at that level, to come in and put together a strong run and see, you know, maybe that sort of top as it turned out. But, you know, I thought it was going to be, you know, maybe sort of high silvers, but that looked very much more attainable to me than, for example, standard, where, you know, it's still quite intimidating to me to sort of think about competing with, you know, those guys that are operating at the top levels. So I thought that was interesting, that the sort of narrowing the gap, you know, kind of came through. And yeah, I think, yeah, to me that was interesting. I can understand why, to people that have invested, you know, a lot of time and a lot of energy in, you know, really getting to grips with those mechanics, it was, you know, more of a sort of concern, if you like. I think, yeah, that leads into combat, because I think, yeah, there's a similar view there. So as you say, combat was difficult in a number of areas, and, you know, I was using shots of triple sized, you know, reasonably sort of liberally through particularly hardcore, but also softcore, you know, which is obviously not something you'd normally, you know, waste glove charges on in a standard run, say. So I think that was a big consideration. We've already talked about the retro cape and that having a good role, and I think, you know, where you were spitting, nostalgia-ing, yellow raying, so, you know, multiple combat actions in a fight. Obviously, spitting sort of causes is it flip out, whatever it is. So there's a high risk or a high jeopardy element to those spits, and clearly the downside of losing, you know, those fights where you've used a camel spit, you've used an envy, you've used nostalgia potentially, and then you lose is high. So yeah, that was a big consideration, but manageable. And again, you know, I think people have got used to, say, in standard, operating at, you know, very high monster level. So I think my first sort of Cramco leveling chain at 100 and something monster level, you know, I died on. Now, that's not what experienced players do, because they know that they've got the right skill set and they know what they need to use. Yeah, so this was, to my mind, it was not a different problem, but it needed a different solution, and that was the challenge that it gave.
I think that's really interesting. I think one thing you said that really resonated with me is this idea of, like, you lose something because you're in an avatar path and you can't use all of those skills. I think that Robot, and one of the reasons that some speedrunners found Robot a little bit of a, not turn off, but just like a path that wasn't quite up some people's alley, was, like, when you mentioned that thing about triple size, that absolutely resonated with me, because in my first, like, 2 to 3 runs, I never used triple size on a spit. I never used triple size to try and survive a combat, because I was just like, that doesn't save a turn. That's, you know, I could save a half a turn by using a macro, which is 2 triple sizes. That's not a thing. And that's just sort of like something that has been ingrained because I've been speedrunning for a decent amount of time. But at the same time, like, that was the wrong choice. In my first few runs, I consistently would die to, like, 1 spit a run. I think there was one run I died to 2 spits. I lost an envy, I lost a nostalgia. Like when you lose those resources, you've made the wrong decision. The right decision is just play it a little bit safer and win the combat. So by the time I was doing my last run, I was in a similar place. I don't think I used them as liberally as kind of you described, but I definitely was starting to kind of get that different muscle memory. And I think that in some respects, like that actually was a little bit of a help to you, because like you don't have some of those, what's the right word for it, like
Biases.
yeah, like instincts of like, oh god, I can't use a triple size on this is a complete waste of that triple size. And you were able to kind of see through oh wait, that's actually the exact right thing to do. If I lose this, that would be terrible, so I'm not going to lose this.
Yeah, agreed. And I think there's a similar point around the sort of energy conundrum and understanding how to manage energy. So leveling in standard, you guys have internalized that. You just sort of know how to do it and what the right answer is and where you should be at each level. That's something I've got to go away and learn, and I'm trying and I'm getting there. But energy, it's a similar level of complexity, I think, in terms of what you're trying to manage and how you're trying to sort of judge what your level of ghost usage is. But the thing for me is I'm starting from the same place as you in trying to understand it. So off we go. It's a level, it's a level playing field, at least in terms of the start point. And that, as I say, was just remove that initial layer of, I don't know, intimidation, whatever the right word is. But as I say, I can understand entirely when you've invested the time, that doesn't feel like something that you want to start again on. So it's sort of a few different perspectives, I guess.
Your point on energy is also very valid. The thing I would say on energy is, and I think Sawyer was the first one to say this in one of his like end of season streams, was just energy was actually really well designed. I think that as you built out your final calculators and built out your final energy plans, like I know we're talking a little bit about some of the reasons why people wouldn't necessarily have wanted to play the path, but I think one reason that the path was actually pretty compelling was that energy was really, really nicely balanced. Like you would think that using one specific thing for both of the majority of your leveling and the majority of your turn gen would actually be kind of difficult. And it is, but it's not an impossible optimization. And it is one that actually had very nuanced and rewarding answers once you kind of solved out your run for it. I think the fact that you generated almost exactly the amount of energy that you needed was very cool. And that's one thing that, from a dev perspective, I mean, my assumption is that the path was balanced with a relatively careful eye by a lot of our friendly player devs, but I do think that turned out really, really nice. And for all of the things I hate about Robot, like combat and item drops and
Commerce Ghost,
and how many turns you have to spend on the Commerce Ghost. Yeah, exactly, Lyft. But like the energy stuff was super, super cool and very well designed and a really interesting experiment and just a different way to play the games.
And case in point, if you look at my Ascension history, my last robot run was the 413, but the three before that are on the history of softcore. They were hardcore fails, so they were just not getting that balance right. And it's just so tantalizing because the perfect answer is to finish with 0 energy, right? You've got it exactly right. So trying to strike that balance, I had 3 runs in a row where I just couldn't finish in hardcore in 2 days, and I dropped path and moved on and tried again. So it was as you say, it was an interesting challenge and a new one as well, which I guess in a game this old is fun to get something new in there.
One other thing I did want to touch on, Tess, I think you talked about this a bunch in the channel in season, but item drops in this path were really punishing. Like that was a pretty difficult constraint, and it was kind of hard to use even like all of the limited resources in a good way. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Like you said about the tomb rats and envy, I actually didn't do that. What I did was pair the otoscope, the lantern battery, the Vampire Cloak, and a Fairy to hit 400% for the Tomb Rats. And on top of doing that, I also kept the Lantern Battery buff to use in the Hole in the Sky, the Nook, and the Abu Peak. I think that was one of the strongest ways throughout the 30 turns of the plus 100% item buff. And other than that, item drops as robot sucks.
I remember a significant portion of the run, you basically are running with like 20% item drop, and it just feels so bad. You're just like, what is happening? I'm not getting...
Unless you did a very specific and annoying thing with your loadout, you could sometimes not get the Black Forest Blackbird parts, because those need 100% drop.
I don't think I missed them in my run, but I think I realized after the second drop that I wasn't capping it, and was just like, oh my god, I'm happy I high rolled that.
I missed a few of them in my prep runs, and then I realized that the horrible thing that you have to do is use the Vampire Capes 15 plus Bat Form, the Astral Mask for 20, and the CPU upgrade for another 20. And that was one of the few ways to get 100% item drops. Terrible.
Spending 50 energy on 20% item drop feels really bad, but it was kind of necessary for this path. I'd be curious what you think about this, Ricardos and Tess. I do think the art and the writing for this path was actually pretty good. Certainly liked Tobias J. Cybot, all of the boss bot, and all of the just really janky enemies that you fought this path. Would be curious to hear what you guys thought about the overall quality of the writing and just the concept.
I like the overall concept the same way. I got to be honest, I don't read the detail of the text, so I can't comment on that. But
Yeah, pretty much same here.
Not rooting for me. I mean, I've talked about triple sized, so it was more about resource usage and planning. I think I had a point. I'm trying to remember where it was, but it was late on day 2 where a glove macro would have saved me a turn, but that would have left me without the triple size that I wanted to just hold back for the tower. So, there were triple size shots that I was planning into the run, which, as we've said, is not something that people are used to. So resource usage influenced. I think it was manageable. I mean, it was pretty exciting sometimes, kind of clicking spit on, when you were looking for your whatever, for bowling balls and, for smoke bombs or whatever it was, and sort of feeling that was a little bit on the edge as to whether you might survive it or not. But I think with planning and paying attention by the end, I'm sure everybody had some of those fights they lost, but pretty much once you'd done it once or twice, it was so painful that you made sure it didn't happen again, is how I'd look at it.
This feels like a good time to talk about one of the reasons why Disco Bandits were basically the class of choice for all the leaderboard runs.
You were noting, Ricardos, there are both reasons on the sense of just like, hey, you're going to hold up some resources for combat, or you're going to do some slightly different trade-offs than you would do in standard. One of the reasons that Moxie was so dominant in this path is that it was actually a little easier to play than Mist. Now, for reasons that I think we at least touched on previously, muscle classes just are not feasible for robot. You end up having to spend a wild amount of extra energy. It just does not work because you need to get your muscle stats up to a certain standpoint. You either need to spend more turns of Commerce Ghost, or you need to send a lot more Statbot turns. It's just kind of a non-starter. So you kind of are between Mist classes and Moxie classes, and while the birds were better for Moxie, which helped kind of cement Disco Bandit's dominance, the fact that Moxie is actually a useful combat stat and Mysticality is a completely useless one was actually, I think, part of why Disco Bandit ended up kind of coalescing as the correct choice, so to speak. I will note, though, you didn't get pickpocketing, which would have kind of made this a more obvious choice.
So you obviously need to increase your main stat to level, and Disco Bandit, and to a lesser extent Accordion Thief, are relevant here because doing so and increasing your Moxie not only made monsters hit you less, but it also made a bunch of quest-relevant outfits equipable, because most of those need Mysticality or Moxie. And because Mysticality is less favorable here, what that meant was you were able to satisfy outfit requirements and leveling requirements by doing a Moxie main stat, and then tossing a few bunches of statbot shots at Mysticality in order to hit 70 for the war outfit.
That was the main consideration. I think, in theory, the machete for the hidden forest needed 62 muscle, but obviously in softcore you pull it. In hardcore, I guess, Tez, did you craft it? That's what I was doing.
So one of the things you could do, instead of grinding 62 muscle for the antique machete, was to skip that zone entirely, spend a clover in the outskirts of logging camp, and use a muculent machete, which had like a 40 muscle requirement. This seems like a bad idea because it would cost you something like 4 turns to do, but no, it actually only requires 2 turns. What you do is you prep a basic meat sword while you're starting off in Vol for the Knoll sign benefit of free smithing, and then when you spoon tune into Marmot, you have to do the one clover adventure for the forest tiers, and then you smith the machete yourself. So you're only spending 2 turns and skipping the hidden park, and then whenever you do encounter a janitor in one of the other zones, you banish and then Nostalgia Envy on it to get the matchbook to get Bowls of Scorpions for the drunk pygmies.
Yeah, so I actually did a slightly different version of that test, but I think mine was okay, but it wasn't amazing. What I actually did was I used Marmot as my first sign rather than my second, which allowed me to essentially free smith the entirety of it. There were a few downsides to this. I think the primary downside is that this means that you basically aren't going to open the island until day 2. But to me, that was one of those things that from a routing perspective was kind of an acceptable loss and not necessarily something that would actually matter that much. It just meant that I would have to kind of high roll the starting hippie for my hippie gear where there are a few non-combats in the queue. But it wasn't the end of the world. The other nice benefit that you get to starting Canada and going to Vol is that Vol actually has additional HP as well as additional initiative. So it's one of the few moon signs that actually gave you 2 buffs, and those happen to be 2 buffs that were actually kind of useful in Robot.
The other consideration that made me try to get Accordion Thief to work a little bit was I think it starts with it's got Mist as the sort of slightly higher stat than Muscle, whereas Disco Bandit Muscle starts higher than Mist. And in softcore I'm obviously pulling enough batteries that I don't care about an extra couple of shots of leveling, but in hardcore, for me at least, energy was so tight that it was something I was trying to make work. So I had a couple of runs with Accordion Thief because of that reason. In the end, I went back to Disco Bandit because I thought particularly the non-combat bird outweighed it, but that was part of my thinking at one point. Just couldn't get it to work.
Accordion Thief wasn't... It ended up that Disco Bandit was better than AT, but I think there were reasons that Accordion Thief could have come out on top. There just wasn't a ton of differentiation, so small things like you're starting Mysticality versus, one good bird buff ended up kind of saving the day there. Frederick asked, he basically said that Scotch which is myself, did a large amount of ghost math for optimizing energy use, but when he looked at KOLDB, he sees a surprising amount of variance in ghost use. His question is just, why was that sweet spot different for different plans? I think my initial answer for this is that just everyone's plan was actually reasonably different. The routing was different. The CPU upgrades everyone took were relatively similar, but the choice of whether or not to actually take the 20% item, the choice of whether or not to use a lantern battery in hardcore, things like that, very much depended on your starting progression as well as the exact kind of nature of the things that you're going to be doing. Was there anything special about how you guys chose how many Commerce Ghost turns to run in your sort of final hardcore runs?
So I think I was 11 in my hardcore run. I think I did 4 in softcore. I'm not even sure I needed them, to be honest. But softcore was interesting. I think I was sort of running out of good things to do with familiars, to be honest. But in hardcore I went with 11 in the end. I don't know if that was normal or not.
I also didn't really know what other people were doing for there, and I just got myself to a significant stat threshold and then swapped out into camel because I was doing the cake-shaped arena trick where I got the camel drinking helmet, which meant more spits and more turns cut there instead. It's actually kind of a pain that we can't see what the familiar percentages were for maybe half the KOLDB runs because they were all using the solar panel instead of familiars, which suppresses their familiar percentage.
I think, Ricardos, if I remember correctly, you actually have a few runs on there where, for whatever reason, I think because you weren't wearing a familiar when you freed the king, you just didn't have your familiar percentage on there, even though you weren't wearing like solar panel for the majority of that run. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was confusing people. I remember enjoying that because it caused a lot of sort of confusion when I put it up. But I think that must have been it around what I was doing when I was freeing the king, because I certainly in my softcore run I didn't have the solar panel on at all. I had a couple of hardcore runs where I was sort of very tight for energy at the end, and I think I put it on maybe fighting Ed and getting the sort of 10 adventures worth of the extra energy shot. But no significant usage in there.
Monkey Man 200 asked about Challenge Pass recently and our general feelings towards skill progression now that we haven't had buckets for some time now. So would you like to see skill buckets return?
I think there's no reason why they shouldn't return.
I think I'm of the standpoint of, if we don't like buckets anymore, cutting progression would be okay with me. I start having fun in the path once it's maxed. And if I could just skip that step and go right to playing the path right away, which is what buckets let me do, that's my take on it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, if you've got a bucket, it doesn't force anyone to use it. But if you don't have a bucket, it removes the option for you. So I'd argue that having them gives both version of the player, what they want.
Yeah, there's only so much time, and the time I spend playing KOL, I want it to be not just farming or grinding.
One of the big challenges of this path was just, I was just really, really busy at my job for the majority of this path. I didn't really get to start running it until, I think, like late April, early May. So I only had like 3 weeks to get as many runs in as I possibly could. I think that skill buckets mean that players that want to play the path won't be in that position of just kind of feeling like they're doing these sort of nerfed competitive runs because they just haven't had the chance to get those the grinding done to get to that competitive run. So I'm all for buckets, but at the same time I know that the powers that be aren't a humongous fan of them themselves.
3BH had just a fun quick question. If you could have picked one item of the month that was out of standard to make robot more fun, what would that have been?
I don't go back that far, so I'd probably go back maybe 2-3 years in terms of out of standard, in terms of things I've actively played with. Probably, I don't know about fun, but latte would have created a bit of interesting decisions, I guess. Yeah, so you've got the offhand attachment that you'd need to have on to use it, or lefty, and we've talked about how some of the particularly plus item, but plus meat would have been helpful. You can think non-combat would have been helpful, so it would have introduced some interesting sort of routing questions. Whether you would have gone to whichever zone it is that gets you plus item, I don't know, but yeah, that might have been interesting to think about.
Probably a boring answer, but the genie bottle.
My answer, I think, is also similar to you, Tess. Somewhat boring, but I think that this would have been a path that would have been very fun to have something like the Aston Martin. The thing with Asden that I think would have been very powerful in this path is that a lot of the buffs would have actually been very useful. Like the 50% item would have been massive. I mean, that would essentially have doubled the amount of passive item that you could reasonably have run. The plus combat actually would have been incredible. One thing I don't think we touched on at all is that there were no plus combat skills for robots. So you were reliant on both having the jumpsuited hound dog, or sorry, the reodorant from the hippie yellow ray. It is true, Tess, you would not have been able to use the Asden specifically in robot, but I think something like the Asden would have been really fun to have, just like that kind of a source of cool buffs, like combat skill. Because the other thing with the Asden that never got used is just the idea of, hey, you can use this to de-level monsters, which is nice. Having something like that would have actually been pretty cool. On the same token of that, something like the Time Spinner might have been kind of nice, just from the, hey, this would allow you to de-level in combat a little bit better, might have been kind of nice.
You mentioned banishes. I guess one thing we haven't really talked about yet that brings to mind is one of the big misses on skills was olfaction. So, yeah, the sort of strength of that you just get used to in standard, and for me at least, sort of taking that away did require quite a lot of thought, and banishes became very valuable along with macros. So yeah, I don't know if, I suppose Latte had a sniff on it, didn't it? But whether there were any other items of the month that might have, addressed that challenge.
This actually reminds me of one very small dumb thing that I did in a run, which this is not a question and this is kind of a tangent, but I do want to just confirm that this did not work. I noticed that occasionally Mafia would still kind of think that I had the familiar on. You'll notice that in a lot of run logs that after you enter the war, if you didn't unequip a familiar beforehand, it'll just add like 60 turns in your run log to that familiar. And I was wondering whether or not this represented some kind of back-end issue. So before entering the war, I put on the nosy nose to check whether or not I would have the miniature olfaction that the nosy nose gives you in the war. You don't. It doesn't happen. It does not work like that. The devs coded it correctly. That was not a bug that could be exploited. But I did think that if it had worked, I would have been very, very amused by this idea of just like a floating nose following me around. Very, very Nikolai Gogol-esque.
We want to cover this part that Phil asks about puzzle combats at the top end. So obviously there were not very few actually hard combats by their own virtue, but because you lacked resources, then that suddenly made fights hard, and if you were using, say, a spit, then that definitely makes things hard. So this was a thing that I figured out a while ago that apparently nobody noticed, but what spit does is doubles the initial monster level of whatever you're fighting on top of making them attack twice. And this is different from other sources because it actually doesn't get affected by de-leveling. If you try to de-level a monster that you spat on, it will try to subtract the printed number instead of the hidden true number, which is twice as high. And this is relevant in places like the Red Zeppelin protesters, where you really want that spit. And this is where stuff like triple size comes in. You can get yourself out of their attack range, which is something like 340. But then that also needs a bunch of other complicated things. I remember a lot of people struggling with those combats because they were doing things like nostalgia, envy, spit, and then trying to hit the monster, which you probably would not have a very good time with. What I did specifically for a lot of those was to go in with the yellow ray as my kill, because that would mean not having to waste a combat round on envy and not have to worry about actually attacking the monster to death. And then I built upon this even further, because the cigarette lighter and later on the Glark cable are also instant kills. So you could go into your second Blue Oyster Cultist with the Retro Cape Stun, go Nostalgia, Envy, Spit, and then afterwards the monster would be able to attack, but then it wouldn't, because you would use the Pill Keeper to absorb one hit, and then you could use the Cigarette Lighter to kill it. And then you could do that with the Glark Cable for the red Zeppelin monsters. Finally, there was one other kind of difficult monster, which was the War Boss. Normally for a kitted account, that's not a very difficult fight because you can de-level it and whittle it down and then just attack or Sawstorm it to death. You don't get those luxuries in Robot. Your HP is very low and it has an automatic attack that deals 50 damage. And the thing you can do there is use the Retro Cape Robot Kiss, which does 20% of the monster's maximum HP and damage. So instead of wasting resources trying to buff up and survive the Robo Wininski, whatever it is, you can just Retro Cape Kiss 5 times.
Yeah, that when you posted the screenshot of that in chat, I just about doubled over. I was like, really? Because I had assumed for the longest time that skill was like capped at 50.
No, it's floored at 50.
Exactly. Like we just didn't quite understand how exactly that skill worked until this path when it finally got spaded by whatever that monster name was. The Artificial Wisnowski, was it?
That might be it.
Yeah, the cigarette lighter trick was really, really useful to me in kind of my last run. So I finally kind of put together that puzzle out of, as long as you use Devil's Kiss on your first Spit Cultist, the other 2 Spit Cultists don't really matter as long as you've generated enough HP that you can survive those 2 hits. But Ricardos, for someone that, like, as you've noted earlier, new to gold starring, how did these sorts of puzzle combats did you find them really engaging and fun to try and solve these in Robot, or were these some things where you're kind of like, oh my god, this game is ridiculous?
Yeah, I didn't find it fun when I lost to cultists.
That's fair.
I've got to. No, I obviously, as we've said, there was no sort of auto ascend. I had the opposite situation to you. I had a fair bit of spare time over the course of the path, just sort of as things sort of have turned out. So, I was really learning by playing and by making mistakes. So, I went through and I lost to the hippie boss, and I sort of tried to work out. I mean, I was throwing a lot of Gauze Garters at him most of the time, I think. But I made the mistakes and I worked out, what the answer is. I landed on the same place in terms of an instant kill, being better than having to find a way to beat the monster after you've used those 3 steps of Spit, Nostalgia, Envy. So, you mentioned most of them. I think Chest X-Ray was one that I, planned carefully and was using for that reason, rather than maybe that you might in standard to extend a buff or whatever. And clearly in softcore, I was, I had quite a lot more, what were they called, shocking licks than you would have done in hardcore. I think I had 11 at my disposal over the course of the 2 days. So, I had lots of places where I could, make that combat safer by choosing to use that. I think I threw a couple at Oil Peak bosses just because at that high monster level, and also the item drop being helpful to guarantee the 12 bubbling crude. So yeah, but in terms of your question, it was a bit trial and error, to be honest. I made the mistakes, and I'm probably not at the level yet where I can purely plan offline and then swoop in with 1 or 2 runs and get to the top of the board.
I will say, pointedly, that was not true for me as well. Like, I was not at the level to do that either. I lost to a billion cultist fights, and my last run that I actually hit my 2-day mark was the first hardcore run that I hit the 2-day mark, because I had 2 failures before that. So I think that, again, the path is hard.
Final one from Frederick. Reception of this path wasn't as positive as some of the other Avatar paths. How much tweaking would it take, in your opinion, to turn this into a good path? Is it just fiddling with some numbers or some more fundamental changes?
Obviously, just really mean kind of decisions, like not having HP increase with muscle. But then there's also this kind of structural issue with the path, where outside of the camouflage curtain, there's basically nothing that the path gives you to make up for the stuff that you're losing. Even Plumber, which was a relatively unpopular avatar, gave you stuff like another Banish, another Yellow Ray, and a really awkward way to deal with Black House. Robot didn't have any of those. And it probably would have been more interesting if there were more scrap replacements for some of those, but it also would have been probably hard to balance.
I think my first run or two, I assumed the progression would involve the CPU upgrades, being more accessible early, uh, which maybe would have solved some of that. I know there was no Banish in there, but if those had been maybe a little bit more tuned to some of the real problems that the path presented, so that you did have a way of getting to answers more easily, then that might have worked.
So I think I'll take a slightly different tack and say that I think that the path was pretty close to being a good path. I think that there were a lot of things about it that were actually very clever and very interesting. I think to your point, Tess, it is exactly correct. Like, there was a lot of things taken away in this path and not a lot given, which as a player can feel somewhat punishing. The HP decision was frankly just mean. Like, it's a great joke, robots are made of paper, but actually playing out that joke is terrible. It was not super fun, like that aspect of it. But I do think that there were a few simple changes that probably could have made this path a bit more palatable. Things like additional item drop, so things like an additional sort of, as you guys are saying, scrap that can give you banishes or give you some kind of path-specific powerful skill would have been very cool. One thing that I do want to touch on, though, is that we have had a few people in the Ask Discord come in and just sort of talk about how this path is a little bit more newbie-friendly than we thought. And I think that that does have to do with some of the mild benefits of the pretty large structural changes that Robot makes to the game and the energy system. Like, the energy system means that a relatively newbie account can actually get some pretty astonishing turn gen. And just using the solar panel as opposed to using an item of the month familiar, if you don't have an item of the month familiar, that's not actually a big loss. It's not really a huge deal. So there were aspects of this path that were actually helpful. They just weren't really helpful at that bleeding edge of speed. And I think that for this path to be more palatable to speedsters, it probably just needed a little bit more time in the oven when it came to giving us things that make the player feel a little bit more powerful, and ideally just a few things that would have made for some decisions that felt a little bit less mean. That would be kind of my take, is that it wasn't super far from a good path, but the ways that it lacked that ended up creating some serious problems that made playing it terrible, at least at first. By the end of it, I do think that it clears up a little bit in your last few runs, but it definitely got... Those progression runs were just hard. Like, it's just hard to start out a progression run in Robot.
Thank you so much, Tess, Scotch, Ricardos, for coming on the podcast and sharing some of your strategies and thoughts about the path. Thank you very much for your time.
It's great to be here, though.
All right, so for now, we'll just thank everyone who listened live, and we'll see you next time.
There you go.
See you, folks.